All right, welcome everybody to Coda Bear's Lunch and Learn. Today's topic is going to be SQL backups. What can go wrong? Absolutely nothing. Everybody's backups are always working properly, right? So I'm going to try and point out some things, whether you're currently doing SQL backups, whether somebody's doing backups for you, things you might want to take a look at and make sure everything's working properly so that should disaster happen, you're in a position where you can actually do your restores and get up and going. So as soon as I can click on this guy here, there we go. So the first thing you want to take care of is what is driving your backup strategy. Based on what you're trying to accomplish, there are different things that you need to set up when you're doing your backups. For example, how quickly do you need to be back up and running if a disaster happens? Do you need to be back up in 2 days? Are you okay waiting a week? Does it need to be 10 minutes? Based on that, that's going to kind of determine how much you're backing up, how often you're backing up, where do you back up to? Do you have to have an offsite recovery point where perhaps you can switch from being an on-premise SQL server to something that's up in the cloud and get going very quickly there? Another thing to consider, how much data can you afford to lose? So for example, if my system goes down, is it okay that I lose 10 minutes of data, 15 minutes, a day, 2 weeks? What's acceptable there? I've actually had one client that told me they can lose 24 hours of data because they don't get that many orders in the system. So if they lost a day, they don't care. Makes it very easy to do their backups. We just do a backup once a day. Other people, there's so much going on. If they lose 5 minutes worth of data, it's terrible for them. They can't input all that back into the system. So they need to do something different so that at most they're only losing that 5 minutes. You'll also want to be aware, what are your retention policies? Meaning, how much data do I need to keep for how long? For example, do I need to be able to restore up to 2 months ago? Do I need to be able to restore up to 2 days ago, a week ago? What is that? Because that's how long I need to keep my backup files around so that I can restore that. Now, I have had people tell me we need to keep 6 months of data. In an Epicor environment, I typically find that hysterical because are you ever going to restore data from 6 months ago and actually use it? Probably not. If you truly do have a use for it, great. But if you don't, shorten that retention policy to what you're actually going to do. Most people, if they restore a week or 2 weeks ago, they're going back kind of far. Anything beyond that, you're really getting into historicals and you're not going to use that data even if you restore it. How much data do you have? Do you have a terabit of data? Do you only have 50 gigs worth of data? How much data you have is going to dictate where you can store your backups and where you can store your data. So you want to know how much data you got so that you can estimate what your backups are going to be. How much storage do you have? Meaning if I go to try and back up the system, how much disk space do I have that I can use for those backups? And if I'm going to do something offsite, how much space do I have offsite? Or if I have an external drive, how much space is on that external drive? If you don't have enough space for those second copies, it doesn't matter that you're backing up because you can't put it into an offsite storage and that's going to cause you a problem. So you want to be aware of these types of limitations so that as you set up your backups and your restores, you know what you can work with. Now, the first thing we're going to deal with in SQL is what is our recovery model, because this also is a major factor in how we do our backups. If you're not familiar, SQL has 3 recovery models. And I'm going to bring up SQL Management Studio here as soon as I can find it in my machine. There we go. So when I talk about a recovery model, for example, I can right click on my train database, go to properties, and once that property window comes up, I'm going to go to options, and you'll see right here, recovery model, and it's a drop down. I can set full, bulk locked, or simple. What do those actually mean? Well, full, every production database should be in full mode, in my opinion. The full means I've got a MDF file, my data file for SQL, and I've got an LDF file, which is my log file, my transaction log. So every time I do an insert, update, or delete on the SQL server, that's getting written to that log file. And what that log file lets me do is I can actually roll transactions back. It's also very important in my backup strategy because that lets me go to a restore to a point in time. Meaning if Bob deletes all my customers at 10:15, I could actually restore to 10:14 and right before Bob does his delete, and I'd get all my stuff back. So I can do that with a full uh, recovery model. Simple recovery model, you still have a MDF file and an LDF file, but that LDF file, although transactions are written to it, they're immediately removed once the transaction's complete. So as soon as I do my insert, it writes it to the log file, and when the transaction's complete, it just shoves it over into the data file. So I don't have that point in time recovery. All I can do when I do a simple is I can do a full backup. So your once a day backup is what you're doing. You're backing up everything. Whereas the full, I've got to back up a few other things. The bulk logged is something that in an Epicor environment, I tell people don't ever use. Unless you're working with a DBA that knows what they're doing, this is something you never want to set. It is also, in my opinion, the most inappropriately named recovery model. In the bulk logged recovery model, what happens is there are operations inside of SQL that let you do what they're called bulk operations. So if I needed to upload, for example, 1 million customers into my database, I can do that with a bulk operation, a bulk insert. There's bulk inserts, updates, deletes we can do. So in bulk logged, what happens is I've still got my MDF file, my data file, I've still got my log file, my LDF file. As I do inserts, updates, deletes, they're getting written to the log file, except the bulk operations. So as I go to insert those 1 million records, they're actually not written to that log file, which means they're not tracked. So when I do a restore, they're not in that transaction log. The only way I'll get those items is when I do a full backup again. So this lets the system do those bulk operations very, very quickly so that you can quickly insert 1 million records if you need to, or delete 1 million records. But you kind of lose that transactional concept because it's not going to log the transaction. You'll need to do another full backup to get that information. In Epicor environments, you don't want to use that because you shouldn't be directly inserting into the database in anyways. You want to use the DMT. So you'll never go into this bulk logged. But if you do have other third parties, they might temporarily flip to this. Let's say you're doing financial transactions, you're doing some sort of financial reporting tool. They may want to bulk insert all the information because you've got so many transactions. That would be an appropriate use of that bulk log model. Insert those transactions, do a full backup so that you've got a copy of your database, and then switch it back to a full recovery model or simple, whatever is appropriate for you. What are our backup types? Well, our backup types are kind of similar to our recovery model. We can do a full backup. That means you're going to back up everything in the database, all your tables, all your stored procs, everything is in there. You can also in Epicor, not in Epicor, but in SQL, you can do what's called a copy-only backup. And that gets into how do we do recoveries. So I'll try and cover that when we go to restore. There is also a differential backup. What that is everything since my last full. So all my transactions since I last did my full backup. So if I did a full on Sunday, and then I did a differential on Monday at midnight, my Monday differential would be everything from that Sunday. My Tuesday at midnight differential would include Monday plus Tuesday's transactions. Wednesday would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The advantage here is when I go to restore my database, I need my full backup, and then I need my most recent differential because it'll have everything going up to that differential. So on Wednesday, if I needed to do a restore, I don't need Monday and Tuesday's differential file. I only need Wednesday's differential file. Put that into place. Now I'm back up and going. Sounds really nice. Differentials can also be very confusing. So if you don't have staff who are familiar with how to work with differentials and how to do the restores properly with differentials, you might want to avoid using them. Typically, when I set up Epicor and SQL for Epicor, I don't use differential backups. I stick with the full and the transaction logs. Now, your transaction logs are kind of known as your incremental backups if you're working with somebody who's used to standard backup terminology. Typically, in a backup, people know full, differential, and incremental. Now, my transaction logs are everything since my last incremental. So my transaction log, in this case, let's say I did a full backup on Sunday, and then I run my first transaction log backup Monday at 5 a.m. So any inserts, updates, delete that happened between Sunday at midnight and Monday at 5 a.m., that's what I've got in there. If my next transaction log runs at 6 a.m., that backup file is going to only have the records between 5 and 6 a.m. So you're just getting that little chunk. The advantage of this, very small backups. So you can quickly do a backup and you're off and rocking. Whereas your differential, depending on how much you're writing, could get larger. And over time, it's going to keep getting larger and larger until you do another full backup and then your differential can shrink back. So your transaction logs are always a little bit smaller when you're doing your backup. When you go to restore, if I'm doing a restore, I need to always restore a full backup first. Any differentials that I've got, well, I shouldn't say any, the most recent differential that I've got, and then transaction logs up to the point that I want to restore. If you don't have differentials, you're only going to do your full restore and then your transaction logs. Now that may sound like a lot of work. SQL is actually really nice to you when you're inside of SQL Management Studio. When you go to do a restore, there's a file selector that pops up and says, what do you want to restore? You can choose your backup file and all of the transaction logs, doesn't matter. Hit OK. SQL will actually read the headers on all those files, put them into the proper order, and restore them all as one operation. So you don't have to go through and go, give me my full backup, then restore this transaction log, then this transaction log, then this one. Do them all at once, and SQL will go. Now, the advantage of the transaction logs, like I said, if you're in full recovery model, I can restore to a point in time. So I need that transaction log because that's going to tell me where I can restore to. That also gets into how frequently do we do those transaction log backups. So if I can only lose 15 minutes worth of data, then I need to have my transaction logs running at least every 15 minutes because that's the amount of data that I can lose. If I can only lose 5 minutes of data, my transaction log backups better be running every 5 minutes because that's what I've got in order to restore. I can only restore up to the point where I've got my last transaction log. So if the system crashes, when does it crash? I should have a backup before that. How old is that backup? That's your amount of data that you're going to lose. Kind of covered the point in time already. Now this gets into maintenance plans. That's how you typically set up your backups. Typically, I would recommend for most people in an Epicor environment that they have these 3 maintenance plans: a daily, a weekly, and an hourly. Your weekly is going to do your other, it'll do your backups, but it will also do your other operations, such as make sure your indexes are not fragmented, do your database consistency check. If you're using SP Blitz, run that, those types of operations. It would also do your cleanup. So getting rid of your old backup files. There are cleanup tasks inside of the maintenance plan that'll do that. And you want to make sure you get rid of both your backup and your transaction logs if they're old. That gets into that retention period that I talked about. How often can I run that cleanup? And how much data do I want to clean up? Do I need to keep 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? You can set that all up in the maintenance plan. It's very easy, wizard driven. For my daily, I typically tell my customers, do a full backup. So get everything. That way, when you go to restore, I've got everything from, let's say, midnight, and then I just have to run my transaction logs in. So it's very easy to do. Hourly, this gets into how much data can I afford to lose. So my hourly plan is backing up my transaction logs. So hourly, I would back up my transaction log. If I can only lose 15 minutes worth of data, instead of having an hourly plan, I probably want a quarterly plan, or I'd name it every 15-minute plan or something like that, and have it run on the 15-minute schedule or the 10-minute schedule, whatever you need. So that's what's running your transaction log backups so that you can do that restore to the point in time and only lose the amount of data that you say that you're going to lose. You need to know what are you backing up. In SQL, there's multiple things you can back up. Obviously, you've got your production database. You want to back it up. And it might be running in a full recovery model. Your test and pilot databases, those might be running in a simple recovery model. So you only care about doing a full backup on them. Why? How often does that data change? And do you care? Do you need to restore to a point in time, or can you just restore to midnight and people would be happy? Usually your test and pilot are people fooling around or they're doing some development. So if they lose 8 hours worth of work, not a killer. They usually have the code in their head or whatever they were working on. So it's not a big deal. If it is going to be a big deal, then perhaps you need to also set those to full and you can do those transaction logs on those as well. If you've got third-party databases, you'll want to make sure that you also consider them. Do they need to be in a full recovery model? Do they need to be backed up nightly? Do they need to have transaction logs? Each database can work a little bit differently. But when you set up those maintenance plans, they're usually working against all your databases. So they can figure out, okay, this database is simple. It doesn't have transaction logs. It doesn't try to do the transaction log backups for that database. So you don't have to worry about flipping things around. You also want to make sure that you're backing up the system databases, meaning master, model, MSDB. Master is the database of databases. It's basically the database that says, what are the other databases I have in my system? It's good to have around. If you don't back it up, you can recover it, because when you create SQL, it's going to give you an empty master database. And as you add or restore databases to it, it'll create that master database again. So it'll get all the entries. That one's not quite as critical. Model is the database that's kind of used as a pattern when you go to create another database. So how big is it? What's the auto increment size? Things like that. Model also has your job information. So any jobs you schedule in SQL Agent, your maintenance plans that you have out there, those are actually stored in Model. So Model's kind of important to get backed up, because if you restore your SQL server, let's say the entire server crashes, you rebuild the server, you go to restore your databases into it. If you don't restore Model, you're actually going to be missing your jobs and your maintenance plans. And that could be a headache to try and remember, what jobs did I have out there? What were their schedules? How did those things work? So it's a good thing to back up. MSDB usually contains your system stored procedures. Not killer critical, because when you create a new SQL server, it creates it by default. So it's not killer critical, but it's very easy when you're doing the maintenance plans to just say, do all system databases or do all user databases. Just let it do all system databases and you get all three. These are typically very, very small databases, so they're not going to have a huge impact on your backup and restore. Usually I'll tell people, go ahead and do compression of your backups. Now, when you do compression, a lot of people are like, ooh, cool. I only have to have about 50% of the size of my database on my disk drive, and then I can do my backup. Not quite. What actually happens, or it seems like what happens, I don't have proof of this, it's just what I've kind of observed, is SQL will back up your database and then it does the compression. So you kind of need that full disk space, and then it will run a zip compression on it. Usually you get somewhere between, I wouldn't go as far as 50, maybe 60 to 70% to 80% compression, depending on what all's in your database and how good the compression algorithm is working for the version of SQL that you're on. So you can get that compression. I've also seen where it looks like it'll write a section of the backup file, compress it, and then write another section, compress it. So you may not necessarily need the full size of your database when you do the backup, but it's good to plan on that so that you don't run short of disk space. Now, every time you run the backups, you're going to need that disk space. And when I say that disk space, I mean when you run a full backup, you need that space to be able to run the full backup before you do the compression. So again, if you're keeping 3 days of information, you're going to need 3 times that size. If you are keeping 3 weeks of information, you're going to need 21 times that backup size. So it's always good to keep a monitor of how big are your backups getting, so that you can plan how much disk space you need in order to do those backups. And if you're going to be doing things off-site, how much space are you paying for off-site? Whether that's a removable drive, something up in the cloud, whatever, you're still going to pay for it somewhere. So you need to know how much space you've got and you don't run short. The 3-2-1 rule. And if you like, yes, the girls are playing with these lovely little black and white kitties, and it says things will go horribly wrong in 3-2-1. So the 3-2-1 rule means you've got 3 copies of your data. You've got your production and you've got 2 backup copies. Your backups are on 2 different media types, and you keep one of those copies offsite. The reason for this is it gives you some redundancy when you go to restore things, or if you've got failures. So if I've got 3 copies of my data, 2 of them can fail and I can still go back. So I've got my live, I've got a backup and another backup. So if my server crashes, I've got 2 backups to go from. If one of those backups is bad, I've still got a second backup, so I should be able to restore. The 2 different media types, that comes from the days when we actually spun things to tape. So you didn't want things just on disk. You didn't want them just on tape. You wanted two different media types. And the reason for that is what happens if that tape drive goes bad? And you say, oh, tape drives never go bad. Yes, they do. We've actually had customers that were backing things up to tape. Their tape drive went bad. And guess what? It was so old, there's no other vendor that has it. Um, you can go on eBay and they still couldn't find it. So although they had multiple backups to restore from, the device that was doing the restore was bad. So you want to make sure you've got two different media types in case that device that you're writing your media to goes bad. You've still got another copy that you can restore from. The reason for one copy offsite, I typically, I think this is kind of obvious, but worst case scenario, tornado hits your building. If you don't have an offsite backup, guess what? All your backups just went up with the tornado as well. So having something that's offsite allows you to restore in the case of a true disaster. Now, this 3-2-1 rule, it's been around for a long time. There's an alternate version of it for the cloud, 3-2-2. So in this case, you still do 3 copies of your data. Your 2 different media types can be just hard drive and cloud. Those count as 2 different medias. The offsite copy, although you can move something up into the cloud, make sure that you've got a copy in 2 different geographic locations. So if a disaster hits the Midwest region, let's say the Mississippi floods, well, that just took out your data center in Des Moines, Iowa, for example. So if you've got a copy in Des Moines and you've also got a copy in, let's say, Vancouver, it would take a major disaster to hit both of those. If you want to get even more separate, you could put something over in India. So that way, if something happens to that geographic region, you've still got another copy that you can restore and get back up and going. Keep in mind that doing those different geographic regions, doing those multiple copies, they all take money to do. So if you've got a limited budget, you may have to trim down your expectations. Maybe I can only keep 1 copy offsite, or maybe I can only do so much with this. Maybe I have to turn things around. I've got to run another compression. So take a look at how things are going so that you stay within the budget that you can afford. Or not even if you can afford. Make sure you're not spending all your company's money just to do backups that are never going to get restored. You want to make sure that you're using things wisely. Now, there are third-party softwares you can use to do backups. There's Veeam, there's Acronis, there's Mabs, there's a whole bunch of other things. If you are using such a tool to back up your SQL Server, and I'm talking specifically when using these tools to back up SQL Server, make sure it's backing up what you want it to. I have often gone in and specifically seen Veeam. It's not that Veeam is a bad tool. It's that people don't set Veeam up properly. They go in and they tell Veeam to back up SQL. Looks like everything's going great. By default, what Veeam does, though, is those transaction log files, it truncates them. And so basically, all you're doing is a full backup every night. And when you tell it to do, when it does that full backup at night, it just truncates the transaction logs and you lose them. Not really cool. Now you've lost your point in time recovery. So be aware that those things do require setup. What I typically tell people to do, use the backup software to back up your disk. Have Microsoft SQL back up the databases to disk, and then your third-party software can take those files and put them into whatever storage you need, whether that's offsite, a NAS device, or an external drive, whatever. But let SQL take care of your backups. Part of the reason for this is if you go to do a restore, you'll also need to know how to restore out of that third-party software specifically for SQL. That can be a different process. Restoring files, pretty much everybody works the same way. Select the file, put it back on the disk, no big deal. When you're going to restore SQL, depending on your software, that can take on a whole different UI that you have to handle. And if it's 3 in the morning and you're trying to get back up in the next 15 minutes, often that can be a problem to think about. The SQL restore, very straightforward, and it's always the same across all versions of SQL since I think 6.5 is when I started working on SQL. It's taken on a few different, there's extra checkboxes or something as far as doing the backups and restores, but basically the overall process is always the same. Select your files, tell it to restore, tell it where you want it to restore to, give it a database name, you're off and going. So that's a lot easier to work with. A couple of tips. Um, Wherever you're putting your backups to, so if you're having SQL backup to a disk, check that folder out. Um, you want to make sure that it's always got enough space. You also want to make sure somebody didn't just dump a copy only backup somewhere that they shouldn't have and it's sitting out there and 3 years old. Because if you're having your third party software back up that folder, it's extra space that's having to be backed up. It's extra stuff that's going off site. It's extra space in your off site area. So make sure you look at that. Make sure that the old files are getting cleaned up as you expect. It's very easy to just go, they're getting cleaned up. And then, a month or two, year later, you get this warning that says you're out of disk space. That's not the time to have that happen. You want to be proactive about that stuff. Stay ahead of the game. I can't stress this next one enough. You are responsible for your backups. Doesn't matter whether you hire me, whether you hire somebody else, whatever you do. You are ultimately responsible for your backups. When it's 3 a.m. and the system crashed and you're doing the restore, if there's no backup file to restore from, nobody, doesn't matter who they are, can just magically create a backup for you and have it restored. You're the one that needs to make sure it's there. You're the one that needs to make sure that it can get restored, which gets me to the point of the only way you know a backup is good is by restoring it. You don't know that it wrote to a bad sector on disk. You don't know that an alpha particle hit the internet and flipped a couple of bits and now that backup is bad. Whatever it is, the only way you know that your backup is good is by doing a restore. Does that mean you have to restore every backup to know that daily everything is working right? No. What I typically tell people, once a month, once a week, whatever it takes, do a restore so that you know that you've got a good backup. Document those procedures on how to do your backup as well as how to do the restore. If it's 3 a.m., that's not the time to go, what's the next step after this? There's going to be people breathing down your neck. Everybody's going to be in an uproar. You want to make sure I can just follow this, check the items off so I don't even have to think. Just do these steps in this order. By doing a regular restore once a month, once a week, whatever it is, you can also verify those documents haven't needed to be changed. Maybe there's an upgrade to SQL that happened. Maybe you added another third party that you have to go through. You change from Acronis to Veeam or Veeam to Mabs or whatever it is. You need to make sure that document stays up to date so that you can do those restores. And again, you don't have to think. If it's 3 a.m., not the time to try and think. You just want to follow your steps. Strongly suggest have something that's going to monitor that drive space. If you're going to spin your backups to disk, you want to make sure something is monitoring that disk so that if something gets out of control, you're getting a warning long before that drive starts to get full. You're getting something that says, hey, that drive's taking up far more space than it used to. That might be accurate. It might be something you don't have to worry about. Maybe you added a whole nother company to your Epicor database and they're doing a lot of transactions, or you imported a whole bunch of new customers into Epicor. Whatever it is, it might have a reason. But if you don't monitor it and you don't get that warning, how do you know whether it was good or bad? You got to do that. When you go to do your jobs in SQL Management Studio, so I'm going to flip over to SQL Management Studio here. And I'm going to, I forgot to expand my agent before this started. Well, let's go to my daily plan here, and I'll just right click and go to properties and go to notifications. You'll notice I've got an email going to the DBA team. That's an operator defined in SQL agent. And I have this going when the job's completes. I see a lot of people that set this to when the job fails. The reason I always tell people do it when the job completes. How do you know the job was successful if you don't get notified? If you're only notified of failures and somebody turns off the SQL agent, you're not going to get a notification that it finished. And you're not going to know that the agent isn't running. If you get an email, whether the job completes, or I'm sorry, whether it succeeds or fails, now you've got something you can monitor. You can set up an Outlook inbox rule that says, if it says it was successful, go file it. File it in a folder once a day, go look at that folder. Yes, I've got messages, everything's good. Have the failures still stay in your inbox so that you look at them immediately. But if you don't get that success message, how do you know the job ran? The only way you're going to know is if you come over here and you right click on your job and you say view history. Well, if I'm doing that, I'm bringing up SQL Server. I have to wait for the SQL Management Studio to come up. I have to do this, blah, blah, blah. If I can just look at my email, I'm already in my email for the day. Might as well just stay in there. So it's going to work a lot faster for you, a lot more efficiently. While I'm here, I talked about that copy-only backup. I am on a transaction log backup. Let me do my daily plan. I think I double-clicked. Yes, I did. Let's move you away. Let's go to the daily plan. And I have a daily full here. Where that copy-only backup is set is under my options. Here's the checkbox for copy-only backup. I also tell people always check this verify backup integrity, perform checksum. Those are 2 extra steps that SQL will do when it's doing the backup to make sure the backup is good. Again, the only way you know it is 100% good is if you restore it. But it will do a checksum to make sure that what it wrote to disk is what it thought it needed to write. It will also do a second read and compare it against the backup file. That's the integrity. So it's doing these checks, but again, something could happen. There are ways to actually, if there was enough damage, the checksum can still recalculate to the same value and you'd have a bad backup. So be aware the only way to do that, have a good backup, is to make sure you do a restore. All right. Some places where you can go to get more information. Obviously, we do some training with CodaBears. On our website, under the news white paper section, there's white paper that goes about how to do your backups and how, whether you choose to do a full, a differential, or a transaction, how that affects what's called your backup chain so that you know what you have to restore and how that copy-only backup affects that chain. It actually doesn't affect it. It's a good thing. But when you do a full backup, it writes that other marker in there. And of course, our YouTube channel, which is where videos like this from our Lunch and Learn will be posted. So you can go onto YouTube, do a search under CodaBears. So I will open things up to questions. I'm going to hit the I've got from Lisa. If it's a simple model, should I expect log files to be very small? Yes, Lisa. Typically, your log files are very small, although remember that it writes that transaction for whatever you're trying to do. So let's say I was doing a million row update. That transaction log is going to write that million rows of updates that I did. And then once it's done, those get deleted out of the LDF, but it may have had to grow the LDF file to hold the transactions while I was there. So typically they're small because you're only doing a couple of things and then it gets pushed over to your actual data file, but they could grow large because you did something huge, and that's to be expected. If that does happen and you're only going to do that huge thing once, you're free to go back in and shrink that LDF file back down. But I typically tell people, let those LDF files, those log files, let them grow to whatever size they need to be, because you're probably going to do that same thing again, and it's going to need that disk space. So you don't want it to have run short when it gets there. Let me know if that didn't answer your question, Lisa. And if anybody else does have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat window. If I didn't mention, this session is recording, and we'll get it posted up onto the YouTube channel. If you want to get notifications that new videos are available, I think I just posted a bunch last week. I do send emails once they get posted out onto YouTube. So just contact sales at CodaBears and have them add you to the group for video notifications, and you'll get those automatically. And if there's no other questions, I'm hitting the end of my world here. So I'm going to bring up my final slide. I think I've got one more. Ta-da! There we go. So I'll hang out for just a little bit in case anybody does have more questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you everybody for attending. If you enjoy these, please sign up for more. Feel free to pass them out to your coworkers and friends, and they can also attend. Just need to get signed up so that we get you invited and get you the meeting information. Like I said, I'll just hang out for another minute or so, and in case anybody else types anything in. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone, for attending.